Sometimes I don't make it, but I try to get here.
Well, we're delighted that you.
Okay, you're good to go.
Well, hi, good afternoon. I'm Chris Mondini. I'm the North America Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement. I can talk a little bit about what stakeholder engagement means. We're joined by Veni Markovski, Vice President for Governmental Engagement, focused on the United Nations and its missions in New York. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
And it's interesting, I'm finding as I go around North America to engage with stakeholders at ICANN, that ICANN is not very top of mind for people these days, which in some ways is a good thing, but in some ways is a bit of a challenge. In stakeholder engagement, really what we're trying to do with ICANN is to help people understand that one of the things that the internet runs on, in addition to all of the infrastructure that we talked about, is people. And so there's this very small but important piece of the internet that, try as they might, its inventors couldn't decentralize. And so ICANN exists to help us with the domain names and the IP addresses and so forth. But all of the policies and all the innovations within that realm come bottom up from ideas from the community. And the policies that result from these innovations affect people who are internet users and therefore stakeholders. So it's in our mission, both as ICANN as an organization and specifically for the team that Veni and I are part of, which is engagement, is to make sure that everybody who's affected by ICANN policies has an opportunity to participate in crafting them. And the categories, we have governments at the table, we have business, we have technical stakeholders, we have civil society and users. And so we're always very grateful to organizations like ISOC New York and to Shuli and Jolie and people that keep them going, because not only is this an important chapter representing civil society and involvement in the internet, it's also an at-large structure for ICANN, which is the channel by which internet users can also engage in making policy. But since there were a pretty small group, it would be great. We could start with questions or what you're most curious about in terms of what's going on at ICANN now. And certainly, we're very lucky that Veni was here. He was not supposed to be here this week, and Veni can tell you about the broader internet governance landscape of what's happening at the intergovernmental level. But it would be great to just make it informal and respond to questions if you guys are willing to approach it that way.
Well, I'll say only a few words. And when ICANN was started, which was back in '98, most of the governments of the planet didn't know that much about the internet because it was still in the early ages. But nevertheless, now at the moment we have more than 170 governments which are members of the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN, and they participate, they have mailing lists, participate regularly at our public meetings. We meet 3 times a year around the world to be able to reach out to destinations which usually are not on the radar that can host ICANN meetings. And on average, our meetings are now about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, depends on the country. And then the governments also have their other fora where they discuss issues related to the internet, the UN being one of them. So not many people know that every year there are discussions that take place at the United Nations. And they have different committees at the General Assembly, and at least 3 of those committees are discussing issues related to the internet. So the first committee deals with cybersecurity, among other security matters. The second talks about internet governance in general, like everything about using information and communication technologies, and the third committee deals with human rights, but also talks about data privacy, data retention, digital rights, etc. So my task is both to educate the UN about what ICANN does, and I do that in coordination with organizations like the Internet Society, IEEE, and others, and also to educate ICANN and the broader ICANN community about what is happening at the UN. So it's a bidirectional educational effort, I think is the right way to say. Whenever there are negotiations at the United Nations and they need some expertise, they now have somebody in town who they can turn to and ask just general questions about how the internet works. And why they need that is that most of the people at the missions to the UN are diplomats. So they don't know how the technology works, but they do know how politics and policies are being made. And that's something that we, on our side, also are educating the community that, there is because since the foundation of the internet, the people, the engineers who created the internet and who are writing the standards, they've always been saying, we don't believe in presidents and kings and stuff like that. We believe in the code. And if the code is working, then everyone will get along with it. But the governments don't think this way, and they have some points. Good points about why there should be an effort to bring those two worlds together. So that's more or less what I do. So we said in the beginning, I'm Veni, Chris, Shuli, Jolly, Walter, and
I'm Louis.
Welcome, Louis. So did anyone think of a question? Yeah.
Well, actually, I think you're summarizing what I've heard for 25 years. I'm such an old timer. I got my first domain name by sending an email to John Postel, at which point the registry was in a loose-leaf binder on his desk in USC. And of course, Postel's second law, that we have rough consensus in running code. When you involve governments, the consensus is not so rough, and the code doesn't run so well. It was an enormous step backwards, but it's one we can't untake at this point. So essentially, I'm just waiting to hear that, as far as you can tell, we're not going to fall in a hole this year. And last year it looked like we might actually fall in a hole. But
what do you have in mind in particular?
Which hole is that?
Because there are so many.
Well, yeah, okay. Pick your hole. But you're here to tell us that, however limping, we're gonna get to next year, right?
Well, no. I think last year you can talk more about the transition because this was the big.
Well, there's so. I've only been at ICANN for just over 5 years as part of the staff, so we're both paid employees of ICANN, the organization, and then we support this sort of traveling show of stakeholders around the world that make all the policies, among whom are some governments. But in the course of the 5 years that I've been at ICANN, there have been sort of, the first big thing that I worked on was, you may know about the new top-level domain program. So you have questions about that and how domain names have evolved and how the marketplace has evolved. That's something that we work on. But to your point, Walter, about governments, sort of the next big phase was a period where some governments and governments within the UN context were really questioning, ICANN's legitimacy. What is this multi-stakeholder model we're unfamiliar with? The internet's a global resources, and therefore its addresses should be global, and we need a trusted global institution. This was a line of reasoning, and that our team really vastly expanded from 7 people to about 30 people around the world to talk to these governments who were very familiar with the ITU and very familiar with the UN, and the UN really starts out with its advantage of being founded for like the purpose of peace. It has that reputation, whereas the countries, 70 plus countries who were sort of asked this question, what do you think of ICANN, would say, well, what is ICANN? We've never met someone from ICANN. We don't know what ICANN is. There's a couple of, crazy people that call themselves the Internet Society that are always coming around and telling us it's a good thing. So we really embarked on this effort to raise awareness, and this is particularly what Veni's governmental engagement team does. And then as part of building trust among all these governments, the US, which held a no-fee contract with ICANN to maintain the registries of addresses, announced that it would let that no-fee contract expire. It was set up in the early days in '98 to give some legitimacy to this new organization, which was just kind of a bunch of guys in a room. And now, as we said, it's got a lot of stakeholders and a lot of buy-in. And so that was a whole, I don't know if you're referring to what happened in the US political context last year, but it became this thing that was really welcomed around the world as the US saying, okay, even though our influence is mainly symbolic, we're going to let that go because we are going to say, yes, these resources do belong to the globe, but they belong to the global stakeholders, not to global governments. And so that was a bit of a fraught time, and just as we had talked to governments around the world to say, here's how the multi-stakeholder model works, every metric about how the internet has thrived and grown and spread demonstrates that this light touch, stakeholder-led approach is nimble enough to keep up with the internet. We had to educate a lot of people in Washington too, and we had to explain to members of Congress and their staff that they're stakeholders too, and we kind of had to drag them to some of these ICANN meetings to see 3,000 people, in their national dress or in their, their suits and ties if they're from the Government Advisory Committee, or their, their Birkenstocks and their funky T-shirts and their techies. And see that it's not run by the US, it's not subject to capture, it's a collaborative bottom-up rough consensus organization. And as Veni said, more governments have joined. We're doing a lot now to try to empower and teach the often mid-level civil servants from these governments how to be effective, not just in ICANN, but when they go to other venues where they're talking about internet issues. We're teaching them the stuff about the internet, which is so important, but we're also just teaching them how to be good representatives on these bodies, because it empowers them to talk across other ministries and within their governments about the model. So Veni can talk more about the year ahead and what's under discussion, what the pitfalls are, but I don't know if that's responsive to the holes that we nearly fell in. We nearly fell in kind of a big UN hole, and then we nearly fell into a IANA transition US politics hole. But I don't know what the holes are.
I would argue that there wasn't a big UN hole, so to say. I mean, a few years ago, ICANN was not really well known and what we do, and it was then when certain governments were saying, well, we don't really understand this, isn't it better for us to take over this management of these identifiers? But it's first of all, it's such a technical task that ICANN does, that most of the people don't really know what it is about. Like, if you ask the average person on the street, do you know how the domain names are coordinated? He or she would probably say, I have no idea they are coordinated at all. Like the same way, by the way, people don't think about how the streets are being named or the numbers on the streets. You live on a street and there is a number on the building, but you never ask yourself, well, how did
I get that
number? And why is it number 4 and not number 25, I mean, yes, in Manhattan you can kind of figure it out, Fifth Avenue serving as the division. But we are more about explaining to the governments that we do not control the internet, we do not control content, we cannot shut down websites. And most of the conversation is actually what we don't do, because they assume that we do. Now it's much different. In the last couple of years, the contacts between ICANN and these UN, the UN itself and the UN bodies is much better, thanks also largely to the efforts that our small, even much smaller group, the government engagement, we're like 7 people, with the help of the government, the global stakeholder engagement teams in places we do. So when you're talking about different holes that we can follow or something, there is always a challenge somewhere. But most of the technical coordination that we do is now it's widely understood around the world. It's still not, again, it's still people don't know about it because the internet is working, and when you type a domain name and you press enter, you go there. Most of the people use probably search engines, and they even don't bother remembering domain names anymore. But clearly the domain name industry is thriving. The fact that we had this program for the new generic top-level domains, there is one in New York City, .nyc. It's functioning, it's working. So all this, having said all this, there is a constant dialogue. I mentioned the 3 committees at the UN which are dealing with internet-related issues. And every year there are new people coming to the UN, and there are sometimes the same idea being brought by a new person. So we need to continue that educational effort, I would say probably for quite a while, before everyone is well educated and well aware of what the different organizations do. We're here hosted or co-hosted by the Internet Society New York chapter. Not many people know why the Internet Society was created, and some people even say, but why do we need an Internet Society? The Internet is everywhere. We don't have the Electricity Society. But the reality is that the Internet Society is the home of the Internet Engineering Task Force, and if you start telling people that these are the people who write the standards, but they are not called standards, and it's very confusing. So it's in this effort, by the way, I have to thank ISOC publicly. They actually provide scholarships, it's not scholarships, rather grants, for diplomats to go to IETF meetings. And this is extremely helpful, because then you have a real diplomat talking to the real engineers, and then they go back to the UN and they explain to their colleagues in a language that they understand. What are these guys doing, and why is it important to stay in touch with them, and what it brings to both organizations? So that's something that, we have had the chair of the Internet Architecture Board coming to talk to diplomats at the UN, and he had a room full with diplomats, and they were asking all these different questions to which he would give the perspective of the engineer. And it's very interesting to see that happening, and to see how the diplomats are asking questions which, if a politician is answering this question, it will be a completely mess. But when an engineer says it, it sounds like, oh, so it's so easy. Did you also want to ask something? Or?
Yeah, but it's a very general question, and I'm not sure it's going to be on focus. I would like to ask, to what extent does what's happening on the internet influences global governance, or influences what is going on in the UN?
So I will also say, looking back at the few years that I've worked in this, there was a moment in time where the internet was really going to solve all of our problems, right? And when people talked about what the internet could do, and what the internet still can do, but it was going to sort of democratize societies, empower, entrepreneurs, connect people to marketplaces, give them many more tools, and empower them essentially. And it still does that. I will say though that any given day when you look on your favorite news organization's homepage, or if if you actually read a newspaper. There's always a story on the front page. It usually has something to do with the internet, and it's usually like a bad or scary thing. And I've told Veni, like the last couple of weeks, I've been going to all these conferences. I went to one conference in, it was at Georgetown, and it's called like the Cyber Dialogue, but it's very cybersecurity focused. And someone on the panel actually said, we have an approaching wall of flaming doom because there's a low-level cyber war going on at all times right now. And then the very next day, I went to a conference that was hosted by the IEEE, the Electrical Engineering IEEE. Do you remember what it stands for?
Electronic and electrical engineers.
Electronic and electrical, who are important stakeholders in internet technical functions. And it was about connecting the next billion and how quickly that will be happening. And it was very much like, flowers and sweetness and health solutions in rural Africa and Bangladeshi farmers and able to be more productive. And I had whiplash going from one to the next. And then I was at a Silicon Valley VC, which was very much like, we're going to make a lot of money, but no mention of a lot of our portfolio companies depend on the internet, right? So I'm always the guy at these things saying, don't just take the internet for granted. But so nowadays the picture is much more mixed, and governments are hearing from their constituents that have anxieties about these issues, and which is why they're coming more quickly and have sort of an impulse to try to come up with what they think are solutions, but they very frequently do it without enough technical knowledge. So, and I think Veni can talk about what's happening with some specificity around these concerns, but to answer your question, generally, the two effects are the question of who runs the internet is becoming more of an issue for policymakers, which is a good, because it gives an opening for people to explain. There's ICANN over here with its technical mission running, the address registries, and there are many other places where internet governance happens. So it's good in a chance that it raises awareness. The risk is, though, that some of these governments bring proposals that would either lead to more fragmentation or impede the other things that are working very well. So things that are happening on the internet bubble up through people expressing concerns to governments, and then governments become more involved. And to Walter's point, there's that sort of risk there that they make rash decisions.
Well, that's always been a fundamental risk, which is never going to go away.
Right.
The internet was originally the only place where it was possible in the real world to express self-sovereignty. And the interest of every government on earth is fundamentally and fatally opposed to self-sovereignty. Governments want to speak for people who would otherwise need no one to speak for them. The thing that the internet did was route around damage, and censorship of whatever sort was the most profound and most damaging. That will never change as long as governments have a seat at the table. Because by giving governments a seat at the table, you are empowering them as adversaries to the individuals who would otherwise, through rough consensus of their self-sovereign selves, govern themselves in a way that was appropriate for them. And who wins? Well, over time, governments do. And then the tenor of the time shifts. Particular governments and particular policies get pushed aside. But once again, it's a question of, are the individuals self-sovereign? this is my address, this is my name, these are the standards by which I communicate, but the substance of that communication is no one's business. You know, the problem never goes away. You know, Facebook has now come under extraordinary pressure to suppress fake news. What is fake news? Who will say what it is? Who will enforce the censorship? When you ask the question, who will enforce the censorship, you've already abdicated the self-sovereignty and the rough consensus that were the defining aspects of internet governance in the first place. You're saying, well, that's broke. We've now got to bring in a cop. And at the point where you say we've got to bring in a cop, you've actually lost on the first principle, which is we can govern this ourselves. All we need is rough consensus and running code.
Well, the good thing though about ICANN is that we don't deal with the content.
Well,
So how those issues are, at least from my point of view, you know, dealing with governments, this is very good that we don't deal with content on the internet, because then you enter into exactly the issues that you were talking about. So what we care is that wherever you are, the global address book, so to say, will be the same, and the internet will be one and united, and you won't get to a different website depending on where you are. And also I mean, I'm not going into the technical details about protocol parameters and IP addresses, because that's for the broader audience who, I don't know if there will be a recording of this, surely?
Yes.
Or no?
Yes.
Okay, so
Going out live.
if somebody is watching it at some point and they're not technically skilled, then it will be a complete disaster to try to explain it. But the way we see our function and the way we explain our function is really to try to make sure that everybody, not only governments, but everybody understands that we are not into the position to control any information, so we don't do that. We don't censor, and you mentioned, you know, the word censorship, and that's, I mean, what one culture or one country considers as censorship, another considers as legal framework. I mean, there was a famous case a few years ago in France where Yahoo, when had to, I think you're from France, or maybe not?
Yes.
Okay, so there was a famous case about Yahoo Nazi memorabilia that being sold on some market that Yahoo was advertising, and they had a choice. Either we'll shut down complete access to all of Yahoo. The French said, oh, you have to figure out something, so they figured out something and found a technical solution. But, you know, to sell Nazi items in France is illegal. So from the US perspective, you know, everybody was able to, about my First Amendment rights, you know, I can do whatever I want. But in other countries, it's not the case.
Well, you know, to follow up, just to sort of follow up on that, in terms of like your registry agreements, what about enforcement, and when are the bad actors that you do have to do something about?
Yeah, so to tie all the questions together, in fact, as Veni says, ICANN has educated the world to the point where I think they understand we deal with domain names and IP addresses and protocol parameters, and also governments did turn up with an interest, and the structure of the government advisory committee where they can offer advice, but they need to be in consensus when they offer advice, and they don't initiate policies, is one where I think governments, you know, you can look at them as the adversary, but some of them among them would say, look, also we feel we have an obligation, we represent people and we want to protect them, there's public safety and other issues and rights that we think that we're best equipped to represent. So that's kind of a model where it's not just multi-stakeholder, it's multi-equal stakeholder, so to speak. And the governments, it's very tenuous and delicate, and over the course of the last year, the governance structures were even more refined. So governments feel they have a voice, but governments aren't driving the discussion. For these other questions, which it becomes much harder if it's about content on the internet, and one of the challenges for us in engagement is we're out trying to get people to come and participate in sort of domain name policy making, whereas what a lot of people are calling me to come talk about is the ICANN model, and can we apply the ICANN model of multi-stakeholder consensus to something like, global censorship or cybersecurity issues, right? Which is a sort of, you could have a whole, seminar on that. But the point that Jolie raises is a very good one, though, because there are still difficult issues related to the content, like, so for example, trademarks that might be used as domain names for which there are protection mechanisms in place, or pirated content that's being offered through websites that are registered, or criminal, recognized bad activity that registrars who have sold a website to somebody, that's happening on the website. And the delicate balance within ICANN is that there's a compliance function that looks at the contracts. ICANN's not a regulator. It really has contracts with registries who maintain the top level of sort of the address book, and registrars who then sell you all your websites. And there are terms in those contracts where if bad activity is happening on a website, you as a complainant first are meant to go to the registrar to complain. But if you're not getting any results, there is a mechanism to file the complaint with ICANN. ICANN has a compliance function which can then give a series of notices to these operators of websites, and if there's no action taken, eventually there is a mechanism for them to be, in breach of the contract. The challenge, as you know, of course, is that it's easy to register a website somewhere else, too. So if you really are a bad actor, you can often find a way to just get around that. But the point that I really wanted to make was all of the clauses in those contracts were actually negotiated among the same multi-stakeholder community. So even though it's very hard to get the wording right, to get the balance between not being heavy-handed, but also providing some mechanism to stop bad actors, there is an opportunity for people to bring that again to ICANN and say, okay, let's look, on a regular basis at these contracts. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one area where the model is sometimes applied to these more esoteric content questions.
I'll take it, I'll give one sort of concrete example. In the case of .nyc, I was contacted by someone when they were up for renewal, I gave them a hard time and said, look, you aren't doing this, this, and this, and this. And so they immediately cleaned up their act. And there was this one guy who was a registrant, and they immediately wiped out his domains that he'd had for 2 years because they included the 7 dirty words. And they'd taken his money for 2 years and suddenly took his thing up and said, sorry, you were against our policy, so we shouldn't have given you a domain in the first place. And he was saying, but it says in here, in your terms of service, that you should have told me that the registry didn't communicate to his registrar, which was Namecheap, to him, that he couldn't, and just took his money. And he said, what can I do about this? How can I complain? And so I put him in touch with Alan, or someone, to sort of feed back in. So the mechanisms for end registrants, and I've heard talk of a registrant's bill of rights, beyond the policy making process. How does the regular Joe registrant.
Well, I mean, I will answer to that just to make one point though. You guys are talking about the governments being the adversaries. I actually haven't seen a government which is an adversary to ICANN. There may be governments which are...
Well, that's just because you're drawing the line in an artificial place.
No. I mean, they may be governments who, you know, you were talking about censorship before and stuff like that, but that's not how they treat ICANN. Even if that was in the past, there have been examples of, so to speak, mistreatment and stuff like that, where you can say, oh, it's hostile. I think right now, actually, the very fact that 170 out of 193 and all the major, like, there are some smaller, like small islands and stuff who don't have like proper, maybe Ministry of Telecommunications, or there is another country which is representing their interest and stuff like that. So almost everyone is there, one. And two, to your question, Jolly, I think when the question is about the registrant, which is the person who has a domain name, and their relations with the registrar or the company that sold them the domain name, that's, again, it depends on the top-level domain that's registered. But the relations are between those...
Should I have sent him to the ombudsman?
Well, no, because this is not an ICANN thing. We don't deal with the end users. We don't.
But if the people aren't living up to their contract, how do you?
If they say that if an ICANN accredited registrar is not following their policies or are trying to, then they can go and complain to ICANN about the registrar's policy. But I haven't heard about such a case, but I'm not really following the registrar's agreements with the end users.
I'm just sort of making my point there, and then I'd follow up and say, on the new GTLDs, on the last rollout, now that the things have gone on and there's been cases of ones that have been sold to other people, there's ones that have given out, top-level domains for no money willy-nilly, and we're seeing things like spoofing with, where if you write it's Apple, but the character is like, not,
Right, like a different alphabet, so it just looks,
yes,
right.
and those kind of things. What's happening with that kind of stuff? Abuse, basically.
So the two things that you raise, and it's good because it's one of the points that I wanted to make today. When it comes to the new GTLD, the new generic top-level domains program, there's a review going on right now, which is a panel of stakeholders, and it's open to participants, including you, whether you want to be on the panel or just submit public comments. And it's looking at something called competition and consumer trust. And they have commissioned, they still have a couple more studies coming in, to commission research on, did the introduction of over 1,000 new top-level domains create more opportunity, give consumers more choice, reduce prices, spur new business models, create innovation, or not? And that is still in some, it's a question. We had a meeting in Copenhagen, and this panel, this review team, issued a preliminary report, and the next report will be in June at our next meeting. So the jury is kind of out, so to speak, but there are people looking at it, and I can direct you directly to those people so you can weigh in with your questions or your comments. On going back to your earlier question about sort of protections and rights and recourse for everybody, registrants and others, or trademark holders or copyright holders. There is also a review panel looking at the protection mechanisms and the rights that if somebody has, it's worked very well. For example, somebody registered IBM.guru, and IBM had used one of these mechanisms to be alerted if somebody used IPM in a website that wasn't IPM. And sort of within 2 weeks, that came down. And so people point to that as saying, okay, so the protection mechanisms are more robust if you have content or trademarks and so forth that are being violated. And I think on your last question, it's an area where we need a stronger dialogue with people that are looking at abuse, other forms of abuse. So there is this type of spoof now with the advent of domain names that are written in other scripts. You can take Cyrillic letters or you can take other alphabets and mix them
Unicode.
in a way, right, so that you can basically spoof people. And there's a working group called the MAWG, the
MAWG.
Yeah, it's malware, mail, and something
Working group.
abuse, anti-abuse working group. And this is an organization of stakeholders from companies and engineers that are really trying to figure out ways to combat this. And to the extent that this abuse comes through domain names, you know, they would sort of sit out here and lob criticism at ICANN, saying, why are you rolling out all of these new, you know, alphabets, for example, when you don't realize you're opening up a whole new way to cause abuse? The good thing is our new CEO, I guess he's been in for a year now, his name is Joran Marvi. He went and he addressed this group. And we said to him, Joran, look, you're going to get a lot of angry questions and you're going to get, and if people here have been to technical organizations, you know, the engineers in the world, they're very direct, they don't mince their words. And we sat down and we met with, you know, people working on spam and people working on these kinds of other abuse. And they've agreed to form a working group, liaison group with ICANN, work with the board has a technical experts group, and just to start a dialogue, because we're trying to bring them on the journey of saying, rather than write an angry letter to our chairman, come join the working groups that are rolling out these new domain names. And even though it's more time consuming, and even though it may take 6 months of being on working groups and things, we need your knowledge of the potential avenues for abuse inside the discussion so that ICANN doesn't make it super easy. I mean, there's always the fact of the matter is with every new innovation, there's always bad actors that are going to find a way to corrupt it for their own nefarious purposes. Well, but by bringing the experts in earlier to the discussion, we might be able to mitigate it.
And what we see happening with this stuff is that it's driving you into the hands of Google or whatever, because they have the resources to like pick up this stuff and filter it before it gets to you. But if you're out in the wild by yourself, then you're sort of wide open to it. So it's another of these things that's sort of powering these very large platforms that in some ways, you know, as namespaces even supplant, you know, ICANN, because you can trust Google to like
filter that stuff,
you know, where you can't trust, you know.
And another important related effort that you might have interest in, I mean, I have to say, when I was first working at ICANN and I joined at the time that the new GTLDs were being rolled out, I was sent to 37 countries to tell them what a top-level domain is, and by the way, you know, if you could get your organization and your resources together, you could have one. And I remember I got on the plane, I had like this guidebook that was 700 pages long about all the rules of the program, and I honestly didn't really know that much about top-level domains. And when somebody explained, oh, we're going to stop having just 22 of them, you know, .com and .org, we're going to have, you know, we might have 500 of them, is what we thought at the time. Now we have 1,000 of them, and I thought, wow, what a crazy idea is this? But I went to those countries, and there was such enthusiasm, especially among, I would say, two groups. The city domains, so the .Londons and .Rios of the world, and .NYC, but also the new alphabets.
Yeah,
so
yes.
They're called internationalized domain names. So, you know, before, when you were Japanese and you had your Japanese keyboard, you still had to have a www dot, like you had to switch, and now you don't have to do that. So whether it's Cyrillic or Arabic or Devanagari in India or Mandarin, like that's a great way to get the next billion people onto this platform. And I think by growing it, you know, also that dynamic
I'll drop
helps.
in right on that and say,
But,
you know, the applicant support program in the last GTLD round was not a great success.
Oh, yeah.
And are you planning to improve on that?
Yeah, good question. So the long point I was making before is some of the software isn't equipped to accept. It's not, if your new email is Veni at Travelers Veni at mail.travelersinsurance.
This is what we call universal acceptance.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, if you're, in the Chinese diaspora in Vancouver and you're trying to type in your, Mandarin domain names and your ISP in Canada isn't supporting it, there's a problem of acceptance of these, and so there's a big effort out there to get all of the people that program browsers and so forth to make them work. On your question about, so Jolie is referencing when we expanded the opportunity for top-level domains, we tried to encourage more applications for these top-level domains from the developing world. And there were very few applications that came from the developing world. And the other big thing that's being discussed at ICANN right now...
I'll make the point here, was that this was a thing that came from the community, and we felt that ICANN staff kind of like dragged their feet on it, and so didn't really make it happen for the people that most needed it. And it's something that as the Internet Society, we promote local content. We feel the key in, especially Africa and these places, other language, is local language content, and, enabling those people to have top-level domains in their local scripts and so on is very important.
So there are, if you're interested in joining a review or volunteering, there is...
Well, I think Adri, who is in our chapter, is
in what's called the next future round of top-level domains, and that's a specific area of discussion. Because we would like to see, we do... to the extent that we're able to attract stakeholders in some of these geographies, a lot of them are entrepreneurs, and they say, oh, can I make a business out of selling domain names, or could I build a community out of having a top-level domain name? And so we're trying to do our part to make domain names as a sector a little bit more robust in some of these parts of the world.
Yes.
Oh, I have a question on a different topic.
Good.
So you mentioned some of the groups that you have at the UN, with cybersecurity, internet governance, and human rights. But you also mentioned you don't deal with content. So how are these things overlapped, or in what sense is ICANN dealing with these things, if like human rights, if we're not really dealing with?
Well, no, the human rights I mentioned data protection.
Data protection. And
so
data
that
privacy.
actually falls under
Okay.
and we have don't forget that when you register a domain name, you provide all this information like who you are, what's your address, where do you what's your phone, and this is. In some countries, this is personal data, so it falls under the data protection laws or regulations, and therefore the interest that we have in this, because certain countries believe that this should be, or maybe not certain countries, but certain jurisdictions make a point that if this is personal information and it should not be, for example, shared with others, and then you have also services which hide the names and like privacy services, but then the law enforcement people come and say, well, we want to know this to whom this domain name belongs. So these are issues that are being discussed currently at ICANN. I mean, that's called WHOIS database. This is one of the hot topics that has been since before the existence of ICANN. And let's even not talk about content, personal data, but think about the fact that if you have a domain name which is related to a particular issue, this particular issue may be sensitive in the country where you live, so you don't want really to your neighbors to know that you're dealing with this. It's not necessarily a criminal activity, don't misunderstand me. It could be something related to health or to culture, and it's not appropriate for you in your village or in your town to discuss those issues. So if you want to be protected, you can buy a service, but then if somebody hacks your website and puts content which is illegal at the same time, what do? It's like there have been such cases in the past around the world where when the UN is discussing this, to come back to your question, I want to make sure that they understand what ICANN does, they understand what the other organizations do. And that's why we combine efforts with IEEE, with ISOC, and we have people from, the Internet Architecture Board, IETF, and companies too. That more and more companies, by the way, understand now that the global discussion that is taking place at the UN and the other UN agencies is important for their businesses. I would say not enough companies get that, but certainly the big ones are there: Microsoft, Facebook, Google, telecom operators. They now are aware of what's happening and they're paying attention.
And sometimes there's just this knee-jerk reaction of some governments to say, oh, well, we'll fix this. We should, we'll call ICANN and tell them to take down all these websites if that happens. Or, oh, we'll make these websites redirect to these, and this just erodes the trust and the functioning of the domain name system. And it's just done out of sort of unawareness.
Chris mentioned a little while ago the internationalized domain names. So here's an example. On Monday, I was at the UN. There was a forum, a multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation. And the topic was actually broadband and how you can bring the internet to the next billion people. Well, one of the ways, and that's why I was there, was to talk about the internationalized domain names and the fact people who use the Latin alphabet, we kind of forget that there are a lot of people who don't use the Latin alphabet and who may have never seen a Latin alphabet. And I always give the example of imagine how we would have felt if the internet was created, say, in Bulgaria, and we use Cyrillic in Bulgaria. So if you have to type a domain name and you are confused because the Bulgarian, the Latin H is actually N in Bulgaria, or the Latin B is actually V, etc. So, and that's still kind of, you can deal with, but what if it was in a country which doesn't use characters at all, but, you have to learn all these pictures and what they mean so that you can type a domain name.
And the beautiful thing is there are linguists and there are Unicode experts and there are programmers that are all getting together to solve these problems for the next billion, 2 billion, and also to enable kind of local content, just a local.
I was cheered this morning at the IGF in Sri Lanka to hear Jihan, I think it was, say that they've made Sinhalese, that Sinhalese IDN is free to anybody just to promote it.
That's great.
Yeah.
You want to go another one? I have another one.
Go for it. I have more, but you can go.
Okay. Going back to multi-equal stakeholder.
Okay.
So some people would criticize ICANN and say that basically it's been captured by the domain industry and not, against the public interest. And so you have, constituencies like the the NCSG, and you have the at-large. But those volunteers who are self-financing, how can they really compete in terms of resources with a well-funded industry? And shouldn't some of the auction proceeds go to them?
So it's a two-part question, I think. So the second part of the question is about something called auction proceeds, which you may be aware if two parties are trying to operate the same top-level domain name, or more than two parties, they're invited to try to resolve among themselves who will end up operating that domain name. But if they can't resolve that, there's a public auction. And any proceeds from the auction, whoever pays the most wins the domain name. And those are all they're in an escrow account. They're tens of millions, if not 100 million US dollars. And there is a working group, which you're all very welcome to join, which is the Auction Proceeds Working Group, because the board ICANN community has always said these would be distributed in a way that's beneficial for the global internet and domain name system. And they're now devoting time to coming up with a charter and enough expertise to figure out how to make a mechanism to decide where these funds will go. So, and I think Avri's on that one too. You have members that are being...
I'm not sure she is, because I asked her if she was on it. She said, no, I'm an observer. I'm not sure if she isn't just an observer too.
I'm an observer too, so I'll look again at the list and see who's representing civil society, ISOC chapters and at large. The the multi-equal stakeholder, I think. This is what I try to say. So I'm charged. Unlike Veni, who gets to always deal with governments, and knows how to deal with governments and be very diplomatic and talk government speak, I get to do all the stakeholder categories that I mentioned before. So I do a lot of like code switching, because we have the civil society and the user groups, we have the governments, we have the big businesses, we have the domain name businesses, and we have the technical experts. And this is what it's kind of shorthand, but I think they all bring their different powers and resources to bear. So private sector actors bring their profit motive and their money. They have money. Governments bring the ability to legislate or make laws and throw people in jail or like fire a missile. The civil society people bring the power of ideas and the number of people that can get to sign up for their ideas and unity behind those ideas. And the technical people bring the ability to sit back and say, you guys don't know what you're doing because I just wrote something that will cut off this entire debate, or you don't know what you're doing because this will break the internet. And so they just bring the key knowledge that all of this stuff depends on. So I think that I see there are different times. I think, again, I'm looking at sort of 5 years at ICANN, where I felt like different groups have been started to sort of emerge as being a little bit more influential. But I feel that there's a counterbalance where the other groups will emerge to meet that influence. So it's imperfect, but we do what we can to make resources available to balance out some of the inequities.
So, to go back into history like a bit, I mean, originally ICANN was a member thing with voting, and they threw it out after a couple of years and brought in at large because that was unbalanced. And the at large is the thing where the general public, that validates the whole thing as a bottom-up multi-stakeholder model, which has to be reviewed. And as we know, there was the recent items at large review, which looked at it and said, these are the same people who just keep going and dealing with it, and that you've got to somehow shake it up to bring other people in. And they introduced something called the empowered membership model, whereby if you could find, he's a good guy, we'll take him and stick him right, pay him and stick him on that working group right in the middle and send him, to like kind of introduce. I mean, I don't know if my summary of what the empowered membership model.
Just to correct something, we don't pay people to go and do jobs. ICANN is everybody in the ICANN community is volunteering. You mentioned
but at the moment the process is that, see, we are an at-large structure. Someone might join ISOC NY, they come through ISOC, at-large structure goes into Naralo goes into the at-large advisory council, goes into you move up through this sort of structure. So the idea that they promoted, and which is resisted, I think, they stated in their report there's consensus, which I did not see from my side of the fence, that we should be looking to make a fast track to bring, that they. I mean, did you read that in the report?
No. First of all, there is a fast track. It's called the ICANN Fellowship Program, where anybody can apply through ICANN to go to ICANN meetings and stuff. And by the way, most of the work that ICANN does is not face to face. It's through mailing lists, and we have now, we use all the technology that exists to make sure that when you have a meeting of some kind, it's online. In some cases it's translated in 6 languages, so even one more than we use also Portuguese, besides the UN 5 languages. We have transcripts, so you can see in real time, even if your internet connection is not good enough for the voice or the video. But the ICANN Fellowship Program, and now there is also a next generation leadership program. This is how people can go if they want to go to an ICANN meeting. I at the same time, I have to say that being actively involved with ICANN is really, if you're not in the private sector that has some business to do with ICANN, you could be at some academic institution, or like when I was in my previous life, when I was with the Internet Society of Bulgaria, we had a very strong group that was interested in all these internet topics. So I was traveling, and it wasn't only me. We had several people traveling around the world or following different mailing lists and then participating actively. But we were the pioneers of the internet, so it was kind of easy to do 15, 17 years ago. Now, and it wasn't so much time consuming. Now ICANN is much bigger. The issues that we deal with.
Let me ask you directly the question: what do you think of the items proposal as against the current status quo of how the at-large is structured?
So I haven't seen that particular aspect of the items. This is the group that did the review. That particular aspect that you're mentioning. But it's a thing.
It's not up to us actually.
But it's
the staff is
right. It's really
the
meant for
community
at large.
decides whatever
Have you read the report?
No, whatever. The
I read this
community decides.
executive summary. So, but it's up to the community to sort of react. But it's a thing that we try to help the community with. So we have this sort of get together and sort of future-proof the community, because you need to have a pipeline. You need to have a pipeline of talent and people with time. And there is sort of a stakeholder journey that, as Veni said, even now in North America, you can apply to be a fellow to ICANN. You can apply for the Next Gen program if you're a student. But then plotting where they go, whether it's into a working group or whether it's into a review team, or maybe they just sign up for the newsletter and they just follow the news. Like, all of these journeys are valid. I always say, and it's sometimes hard because we are graced by the presence of some of the actual pioneers that set all of this up. The inventors of the internet and the creators of ICANN, but also at the same time, it can be intimidating if you're new to think, oh, I'm not an insider, I don't know these very famous people, they all seem to know each other, and we don't really have we worked really hard as a community and supporting the community on ICANN's governance structures, but when you're creating a governance structure, you have to create a structure that will outlive all of those people, all of us, and we're not old enough to prove that we did it yet. So finding a way for someone to start now, we really have to break this problem of, like, if Louis says, look, I want to be involved in ICANN, but I only have, 2 hours a week I can do it. We haven't figured out how to make that work, because it can be some working groups are hard, some grouping are less. So these are all issues that
Let me
for
give you
managing
an example of
communities
an
that we're
items
working on.
proposal, which is, say, the at-large seat on the board would be picked by random choice.
Oh, I didn't see that.
You didn't see that? Which is apparently how it's done, how they pick people in the IETF. This is, the nomination committee picks a few people, and then they
pull their name out.
they throw the dice up. They say we spend all our time on elections rather than looking at
real problems.
real problems.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that's the beauty and of the model of the ICANN multi-stakeholder model, where people still kind of expect that we, as ICANN staff, should know all the answers. Well, actually, sometimes the community not only should provide the answers, but actually they have the right to impose those answers, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So in many cases, we are in the role of facilitators rather than decision makers. I would say
that's true.
In all
And
cases.
so for example,
I would say under the current CEO, that's true. I'm not sure the previous CEO
No,
was.
that you're absolutely right, and that's probably a good. I don't know how. It might be a good topic to wrap up on, but we are very much in the mode of letting the community take the lead and then supporting what the community wants to do. So Veni is right, actually. It's really not our place to comment on this outside consultancy's review of a particular group in the community, but to support that group with whatever they decide to do with it. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense, because like I can talk about the Government Advisory Committee. We're there to help the Government Advisory Committee with whatever they need. We're not there to tell them what to do, obviously, and it's the same with every other constituency.
How much dissatisfaction is there in the GAC with the consensus system?
I mean, do you ask like a scientific survey?
What's your sense of the room, as they say at Wiki?
I think. Look, the GAC. That's another thing. The GAC is right now a very different body than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people. There are now, vice president. There is a chair of the GAC, but there are several vice chairs, and they come from the different regions. But here is an example when the transition started 2.5 years ago, actually 3 years ago now. The GAC was very active.
The transition away from the U.S. government contract.
Yes, the GAC was very active, and they actually pushed that there will be more GAC representatives in the team that was doing the transition. So they got 5 people, I think, at the end, from each continent. So that was actually very good and very helpful for the transition itself, because it's one thing to have 2 or 3 representatives. It's different when you have 5, and I believe that some of those people who were pushing for having more GAC representatives are actually also the most active ones within the discussions. So it was good. So again, the satisfaction level of every GAC member depends on their engagement and what they want to achieve and how they can achieve it. I think overall there is a very good communication between the GAC and the staff, between the GAC and the rest of the constituencies. I mean, they meet at every ICANN meeting. There are meetings between the GAC, be that the leadership or be that the whole GAC with the different constituencies, the names.
I will say they do set an example to the other advisory councils like at large, the way that they come up with their advice fast and.
Well, they have communiques every time, but this is also, you don't need to have every constituency of ICANN to be the same as the others.
No.
And in fact, the end users or the citizens, through the at-large, it is expected somehow that there will be more kind of arguing and debating and maybe not reach an agreement at the end, because maybe there is. That's the beauty of the model. By the way, and I'll finish with that because I think it's important. The word multi-stakeholder and the multi-stakeholder model, just a few years ago, this was like a forbidden word at many governmental and intergovernmental organizations. Now it's in every UN document they talk about multi-stakeholder model and multi-stakeholder engagement, and they understood that this is making their documents and their decisions better because they allow not only a particular group to be engaged, but everyone to be engaged. When the issue is obviously related to everyone. I mean, if we're talking about space exploration of space or something like that, you will be probably not expecting that every group will be interested, and should be taking part.
It's like every municipality talks about public-private partnerships these days.
Yeah. This is another way of putting it. Yeah. Thanks.
Does that work?
Yeah, that's good.
I think we
have one tiny question.
Good.
Yeah, we have been discussing since now about top-level domain governance and stuff, and it sounds like it's more web governance than internet governance, because the internet is not only the web, and now we can connect like web pages through other means than the web. I have a specific example in mind, which is the Ethereum name service, which is a sort of decentralized governance system for administrating domain names. How do you react to this? Is it in the scope of ICANN? How do you position yourself?
So, for the Copenhagen ICANN meeting, which took place already in April,
In March.
one of the best attended sessions at this meeting was of the technical experts group who invited representatives of blockchain name assignment technologies to talk about what's on the horizon. And I personally thought to myself, this is me, I thought, wow, as I said earlier, the creators of the internet wanted everything to be as distributed as possible, and they didn't figure out a way to distribute, to make domain names not require any central organization. But had this technology existed then, I think that's exactly what they would have applied to, so there wouldn't be an ICANN. I think that so I don't know if ICANN has put out any sort of a statement, but I think those are really
these are different technologies.
Yeah,
so there are many technologies about unique identifiers on the internet, and the fact is that each of them, there are people who develop those technologies, and as the old school people would say, if something is working, then people will start using it, and if it's not working, they're not going to use it. But we definitely follow what's happening. This session that Chris mentioned is actually online. You can take a look at the website of ICANN and see the meetings from March in Copenhagen, and find the session, and you will see the presentations like digital object architecture, which is currently used in libraries and publications. Their system is used there. And others as well, and you will see also what kind of questions there were from, including like the ISP constituency and others, so that you can understand better what's happening. For us, we are not promoting it's any of the technologies. We are coordinating the domain name system, so that's our task.
And in theory, the community is set up in a way that it can evolve and react and encompass some of these. So if an innovation comes from the technical community that improves or replaces aspects of what's happening now, in theory, we're set up to be flexible enough for there to be space for that to emerge. So, as Veni said, we monitor all of these. We have a really open dialogue with people that are working in these spaces. And it's interesting. So it's a really good question. Are you involved in Ethereum?
Yes, yeah, in Ethereum. And actually, the reason of my presence here in New York City is to go to the Ethereal conference that will be happening tomorrow.
Fantastic.
In Brooklyn. And but yeah, it sounds like it's a new infrastructure for Internet governance, and I find it very interesting as in the way that current governance administrations look at what's going on the blockchain as a threat or as a risk, and not so much about how it could be an opportunity and a model for new forms of institutions and governance models. So I just wanted to have your input on this. And
it's a little bit like Walter was saying early too. Whenever there's sort of a new revolutionary or disruptive technology that comes along, exactly what you said. Some of the initial reaction of the government structures is, oh, is this threatening our role? Instead of, oh, is this going to make the lives of our citizens better and improve the situation? And then finally you get to a point where they try to figure out how they can convert these technologies to their own ends. But that's great. I'm fairly pleased to hear. Thank you for coming and for the question. And thank you very much, Julie and Jolie and Walter and everybody. And to ISOC New York, we're at your disposal. So if there are just two things. There is a website for ICANN newcomers. So our website is undergoing a totally long-term renewal because it's not a very easy to navigate website. But icann.org/newcomers talks about those fellowship programs and ways to get involved. So anything you could do to help promote that, because it's pretty easy for the newer to the ICANN issues. And then if you use a search engine to look for what is new with ICANN reviews, that blog just came out, and it lists all those reviews that people can get involved with. But maybe I'll follow up, Shuli, and maybe you can blast to the
ICANN
membership.
history.
Oh, and we should talk about the ICANN History Project. So this just launched a week ago, and it's kind of crowdsourced videos and interviews and experiences from the early days of ICANN. And then Brad White, who works in our communication shop, has interviewed all of these inventors of it, and so we'll send that link out. So why don't I follow up and you guys can share with your members those 3
I
items.
watched the Ira Magaziner, who used to be with the White House under Clinton, when ICANN was created. It's fascinating story, including like his memories about John Postero and how how he was brought to the White House for a meeting, and he was wearing his usual, t-shirt and sandals, and had to go like 4-hour security checks because who is this guy? Everybody is dressed in suits and tie, and there is this engineer who must have been back then about 45, 50 years old. So it's really a good
It's
story.
good content, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Unfortunately, you cannot interview John because he dropped dead the same week
Exactly.
ICANN
Was created,
went into effect.
Thank you very much.
Ira Magaziner said something along the lines that the pioneers of the internet, they were, I think it was actually probably at his funeral, at John's funeral, who I only know by phone, because back then I was still not, going to USC. But he said that they were saying that he went first up in heaven so that he would be providing IP addresses for everyone. So that kind of, I think it's a very sweet thing. They used to be. This is a different generation, and these are people who are now in their 70s. So it's a very, very different.
And it's inspiring to see how something like the internet that went from a very small community of computer scientists that all kind of knew each other to what we have now. I just read a statistic today that says we're at 47% of the world's population connected. That changes every once in a while, but
It's just where the original vision got lost. I mean, it was supposed to be the overlay over all of the national networks. It was to provide a universal addressing scheme so that point-to-point communication was possible without regard to borders, national networks, government assertions, any of that. That's been lost for 20 years now. There are only 2 exciting pieces of technology in my lifetime that deal with this issue. Blockchain is the next one.
right.
Unfortunately, that's very quickly losing ground.
Are you going to go to Ethereum tomorrow?
Probably not. I mean, identity, which back in the early days of the internet was addressability, but identity is badly understood. And I know Joe Lubin is introducing the UPort product, which he claims is self-sovereign, is a realization of self-sovereign identity, and it's not. Because by definition, if your program, if your device is a client of some operation, it is ipso facto not sovereign. And until you deal with that distinction, that unless the individual, by virtue of having an IP address, speaks at the treaty level of sovereignty as the absolute equal of any government, any organization, then you don't have the requisite identity.
So we come full circle,
Yeah.
because that was what you started with, right? That's the exact point you started with.
Thanks very much. Thanks
Thank
to
you.
all of you for
Thank
coming.
you.